This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to books and ideas and many other things. I'm your hostess, Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern.
This episode is brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute, an independent center of research and action dedicated to strengthening the foundations of Israeli democracy. If you like us, please consider supporting us on Patreon. You can find out about it on our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review.
Our guest today is Yohanan Plesner, the president of the Israel Democracy Institute. He served as a member of the 17th and 18th Knessets from 2007 till 2013 for Kadima Party, where he also held a number of executive roles. Before that, he was an international businessman and strategic consultant. We are happy to have him back on the show for the third time to discuss the state of Israeli democracy at the start of 2021, in the hope that by the time we'll have him on again, there'll be any democracy left to discuss. Yohanan Plesner, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. What a great pleasure.
So in March, Israelis will go to the polls for the fourth time in just under 2 years. What do you think is the most striking or important thing this tells us about Israel and the state of Israeli democracy today?
Well, the current political deadlock is a result of an underlying cause and an immediate cause. The immediate cause is obviously a very popular prime minister, very competent, very politically savvy, and at the same time is dealing with the risk of going to jail for corruption charges. And he decided to use all of these powers in order to stay out of jail and to try and maneuver himself either towards a state of immunity and so on. So this is one major challenge, a very popular prime minister who's trying to dodge the legal proceedings. And number two, inherent underlying reasons or weaknesses that this current crisis has unveiled to some extent. And those are weaknesses that have to do with the fact that we're a country, a democracy, the only functioning democracy, except for the UK case, without a constitution that secures the rules of the game, and the weaknesses of our electoral system. So those are the systemic underlying causes meeting a very unique situation of a popular prime minister who's doing whatever he can with very little inhibitions in order to stay out of jail.
So you're saying that the two causes are related? I mean, if we had a functioning constitution, Netanyahu wouldn't have been able to do whatever he does?
Yeah, well, we see now that there are no rules of the game. They're completely twisted. When they wanted to establish a unity government and Gantz had next to zero confidence in Mr. Netanyahu, so in a matter of about 2 days, we instigated a regime change, new basic laws that define how our government operates. Just for our listeners, just as a matter of comparison, the last time the U.S. Constitution was changed was a tiny footnote in the beginning of the 90s. This year, in 2020, in order to make this national unity government happen, there were multiple changes in our constitution, and later on another change in our basic law that are the sort of constitute our quasi-constitution, just in order to enable the not passing the budget and so on. So, I mean, there are no rules that secure how the political game is played, and as a result, if everything is up for grabs, it brings about a very unstable outcome.
So I was going to leave this question for the very end, but since you raised it, let's talk about the Constitution as savior. If we had a Constitution right now, how would it save us? We would have to talk about what's in it.
Well,
what should be the constitutional change that would change this instability and this ability to manipulate the system?
Well, the fact that Israel doesn't have a constitution, it's quite difficult to imagine a constitution that characterizes I would say all constitutions. They have a Bill of Rights, or the basic basic freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and so on, equality before the law, basic democratic rights that we almost take for granted are guaranteed. They're supposed to be guaranteed and granted to us regardless of whoever is in power. We shouldn't care as citizens so much about who is in power and think that it's going to change our very day-to-day lives, but rather, politics is important, but democracy is not about we elect a ruler and that ruler has, without any inhibitions and constraints, can do whatever he or she wants. There are checks and balances. So there's the Bill of Rights, checks and balances, which it's called separation of powers in English. In Hebrew, we translated it into hafradat rashuyot, which is separation of authorities, and it makes it easier, that translation, to water down that principle. Because if you say we don't separate, the principle of the democratic principle of separation of powers means that we distrust a situation whereby the majority, we concentrate too much power in one place, be it a president, a prime minister, or any other position holder. And in Israel, when you translate separation of powers into afradat rashuyot, separation of authorities, we're saying, well, the governing authority should govern, the judges should rule in cases of criminal cases and so on, and the people will elect whoever governs. Well, it makes perfect sense.
Well, except then they're not really a check and balance if they can't intervene. I want to ask you something though.
Checks and balances, and securing basic rights and making those rules very difficult to change, the stability of the rules, because again, I'll refer to the American example, but there are other democracies that are obviously better comparisons for Israel because we are a parliamentary democracy and so on. But for the sake of the argument, in America, if you want to change the Constitution, you need the president, you need a large majority in the Senate. I think it's two-thirds. The House of Representatives, and then about 70% of the state governments and state assemblies. So, it's a major, major process, and therefore this secures the rules of the game. In Israel, what is required in order to change the very fundamentals of our democratic system? A simple majority in the Knesset, a majority that every government has. So the basic rules of the game are completely unsecure, and they depend on some norm that we as a young democracy cannot really rely on, as we've seen in the past few years.
I want to ask you about what you said, because I was surprised by one thing, which is that when you said we need a constitution to, have more stable governance, I thought you were going to talk about changing the electoral system in the Constitution, but instead you said something that is,
I think, both, by the way.
True, but
yeah.
the first part of it was particularly surprising to me when you linked the lack of a Bill of Rights, an equivalent to the American Constitution, to the instability of our electoral system. Because if I understood you correctly, you're saying every time people vote, they're voting on life or death because they don't have their rights anchored.
Yeah, and what's at stake over the past 2 years in our election campaigns? Every time we go to an election, we are sort of on the brink of, to some extent, regime change, a basic change of the nature of our democratic regime. Because if you take some of the ideas that were on the table after the first round, after March of looks like
April 2019.
Yeah, April 2019, and some of the ideas that were on the table, completely politicizing the appointment of judges, politicizing the appointment of the attorney general and legal advisors in ministries, basic laws, which are constitutional changes that completely allow the government to override the judiciary, basically concentrating all power with whatever political majority that is around at that time is extremely dangerous, and this was on the table, and therefore, and that makes me concerned, and those who care about Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, we shouldn't worry every time we go to an election that the very nature of our existence as a Jewish and democratic state is at stake.
Israel can barely come up with a government, let alone a constitution. So my question to you is how
I wasn't advocating for constitution, by the way.
Right.
Constitutional changes, for example, a few constitutional chapters that will be secured is a minimal but sufficient
Wait, you're
demand at this
not
point.
actually advocating for a constitution, just specific constitutional changes?
No, I obviously...
just maintaining the rules of the game.
I would love for us to have a constitution, and I think it's a desired and ideal goal, but I would make do with a lot less in order to stabilize our democracy.
So how do we do it? What guarantees that after the fourth election in late March, it would not be a groundhog election, right? We will wake up in the morning to exactly the same situation, two blocs that are unable to form either are unable to form a government, and then 6 months down the road, another election.
Well, nothing guarantees it. Obviously, we've been through 3 rounds, and nothing guarantees it. I think it's quite clear by now that, and it's difficult for me in some way to say it because I lead a strictly non-partisan organization, and therefore we try to be very strong and forceful and articulate about the issues, but not about the politicians and the parties. But having said that, it's very clear that as long as as there's no option to form a government without Mr. Netanyahu, the deadlock will continue. Or else, if Mr. Netanyahu has a majority to pass those constitutional changes that will allow him to grant immunity, politicize the role of Attorney General and so on, and take charge of the judiciary. So it's either Netanyahu will take charge of and erode the rule of law, the institutions of rule of law, or we're able to form a government without him. If either of those things won't happen, we can expect a continuation of the political deadlock.
Why is it such a disaster? I mean, what's really the problem with consecutive interim governments? We've managed so far over the last 2 years. Why can't we just go on forever?
You mean the sun still rises in the morning?
I mean,
I wish listeners could see the sardonic, pained smile on your face when Gilad asked that.
No, I mean, it's a good question because if you would have described this scenario to me as a future vision, and you would ask me, how would Israel look like? I would paint a very grim picture. So there's something very adaptive about our systems that regardless of the fact that it's difficult to imagine. We are running a country with the deepest recession in decades without a budget. The current budget is a budget that was passed in early 2018. We're going to be deep into 2021, so 3 years later.
And maybe more.
And the earliest it would be that, if we have an election late March,
coalition
government
building for 3
May
months.
until you build a coalition.
You have a government already in May. That's very optimistic because they could stretch out.
And then May or June, and then a budget in July, August. So July, August of 2021, and the previous budget was passed in early 2018. So basically we're going through the deepest economic challenge, crisis, recession, without the fundamental, most important tool that a government has in order to deal with that crisis, which is to make adjustments and adaptations in our budget. And all economists throughout the world are talking about the need to put in place reforms, infrastructure investments, multi-year investments, whether it's in health, education, reforming various sectors. None of that happened. It's not only that we are, as a result of the crisis, there's no budget. There are no nominations of key personnel. So the top positions in finance, in justice ministry, in the prime minister's office are not, there are no appointments, and no legislation. Except for COVID-related, very specific legislation. Basically, the machine of legislation is dead, which means no reforms and so on. So basically, the country is stagnated. Fortunately, not the entire country, depends only on the public sector. There's a high-tech sector that fortunately is still booming, and exports therefore, and it offsets the erosion or slowdown in other parts of our economy, and therefore we expected a larger decline in government revenues. And so
one
on.
thing we want to say is that if anybody's interested in that, they must listen to our interview with Professor Karnit Flog of the Israel Democracy Institute, who was on this show, and she's the former governor of the Bank of Israel, and she explained all this very well.
Yep. So, and that explains that, while the government is extremely important, especially during such a heavy economic, health, and political crisis that as a result also leads to a crisis in trust and solidarity and so on, the government is not the only player. And some of the activities of business as usual are still going on, and as a result, the IDF did not approve a new multi-year plan, but we still have a very strong IDF with so it's not like Rome wasn't built in one day, and fortunately it cannot be undermined also in 2 years.
Let's go back to the whole question of why we're in this mess. I mean, you convinced me we do need a permanent government. Israel's political system is famously unstable. The main reason people tend to pin it on is that there are so many parties, and all these electoral reforms that have been tried over the years have never really managed to resolve the problem.
Well,
so why I want to
very few
ask
were
you,
tried, yeah.
very few were tried, true. But I want to ask you, I mean, maybe the problem is not just the electoral system or the lack of constitution, but a sort of political culture in which Israel's voters have been trained over the decades to think that we just must have a political party that fits us like a suit. And if it's not tailored perfectly, there's another party. And therefore, everybody wants to establish a million parties. And it's a kind of political mentality of the citizens and the leader and the politicians.
You're alluding to a sort of a long dispute that we also have within IDI between the different disciplines about whether it's institutions matter or political culture. And
what about both?
Exactly. So obviously the answer is both. But if I have to pick, and again I can rely on my experience both as somebody who observes and studies the system and potential remedies, but also having acted within the machinery of the manufacturing line of politics.
You've seen how the sausage was made.
Exactly. And I'm a big believer in institutional and structural incentives. Politicians are what makes them. Politicians are basically animals with barometers. You understand what is most beneficial for you, and those who survive and move up are those who understand how the incentives of the system work and make good use of them. And in this respect, if we change the electoral system in a way that provides an incentive to create large, more stable political blocks, if we change the system in a way that will reduce the disproportionate power of sectorial parties, if we change the way candidates are elected rather than either by an authoritarian leader that picks talents or a corrupt primary system, but rather use other systems that exist in the democratic world that creates a different set of incentives and helps grow leadership and so on. And all of these things, there are solutions for all of these things. Then ultimately, this would produce a much healthier political culture, and this is my answer. So both, but but institutional changes are much required. There was no political circumstance that enabled such a change. And mainly, again, if we connect it, over the past 10 years, the story of Israel's political system is first and foremost Netanyahu and his preferences, and his preference of first and foremost to solidify the alliance with the ultra-Orthodox parties, very much determined the political landscape and the realm of possibilities and impossibilities.
I'd like to maybe focus on another aspect of the cultural argument and focus on the voter rather than the politicians. And it's really striking in Israel that there's been very little change of political allegiance. I mean, the two blocs have been more or less stable over, since I can't remember how long, right? And if you look at other functioning democracies, you mentioned the United States, there's hardly been an administration that lasted for more than 8 years, of two terms. And here in Israel, it seems like Netanyahu's been in power forever, and he will be in power forever. And regardless of how well he functions as prime minister, right now there's been pretty low approval ratings of his dealing with the corona crisis, yet it hasn't really affected his showing in the polls. You know, is it really this, the deficiency of Israel's political culture, do you think?
Yeah, I think you're alluding to something that is extremely important, which is the basic idea of a healthy political process is a connection between choice and outcome. So if there's we elect a politician and there are good outcomes in health, in defense, in education, we re-elect them. And if there's a lousy outcome, we tell them goodbye. But in the Israeli now an unhealthy system, and we're seeing other systems moving in that direction as well. But we've been around there as well,
ahead of the pack as always.
America's a bit ahead of us on this one. Actually,
is when identity politics becomes the name of the game, and it doesn't really matter what you stand for or how do we rate your performance. Is it whether you're from my tribe or not? Tell me who you are, and I will tell you who you vote for. In Israel, it also what defines, in many ways, the tribe that you belong to. The single most important parameter is level of religiosity. So, if you're an ultra-Orthodox, it really there's nothing really will change your choice. If you're a Sephardi ultra-Orthodox, you will vote for Shas. It doesn't matter how Shas performs and so on. Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox, national religious, there's some movement, but it's within the Israeli right, between Likud, Yemina, Beit Yehudi, whatever their name is. And
that's within the Jewish community, of course. Your sector comes first.
And then there's the Arab, exactly. So, level of religiosity also, and the religious identity. So we see that the Arab, if in the past, Arab citizens voted in larger numbers to Zionist parties and so on, we saw that diminishing as well. So once that's the name of the game, it's almost... tell me where you were born, and I will tell you you have very few little degrees of freedom, and that is detrimental to the political process, because then there's no competition on performance, on outcome, but rather just on thumping, the trumpets, of your own tribe and so on, and calling, and this is accentuated, if to go back to our previous issue, by an electoral system that provides disproportionate power to sectorial parties, to well-defined parties that can be, on the margins and are required for a coalition government. So rather than creating a system that provides strong incentives to build coalitions, to build parties umbrella parties that include multiple groups, we created both an education system and an electoral system that provide a strong incentive to strengthen our tribal politics.
Okay, so this does go back to the roots. I mean, when people are growing up in Israel, they are streamlined into a completely segregated education system. Do we have any hope of having effective electoral reform and change of political culture until we have a change from the bottom, from age 5 when kids go to preschool and start funneling themselves into completely different realities? I mean, right now what's going on with the ultra-Orthodox makes it very stark because they have a completely different worldview, at least those who are rebelling. Very different worldview, and they can't communicate with one another.
Yeah, well, you touched upon a few issues here. So
no, education. That was my question.
Education.
Will anything change until the sectoral education?
Well, look, things can change. Obviously, electoral reform it can change in a few months if there is a government not formed by Mr. Netanyahu, the ultra-Orthodox. Basically a Likud ultra-Orthodox government, which is obviously, if that would be the choice, there won't be any electoral reform. There's not even a question about it. But if the parties from the right, from the center, and the left that do not want to allow for Mr. Netanyahu's leadership to continue, if they would have the majority and the ability to form a coalition, they would need a theme, a common denominator, a theme that will weave together those very disparate parties and ideologies. And what can bring them together, in my eyes, are three themes. Number one, economy, economy, and economy. Okay, you can say it's three, because obviously a deep economic recession, and I think we haven't begun to understand the depth of the crisis and the challenge, because we're still living off subsidies and extended unemployment benefits and so on. But at some point, the Israeli government will have to stop buying or issuing new bonds and begin to pay off the coupons.
And the deficit was growing even before Corona.
And there's a huge challenge. So there's a huge agenda for a government, even if you forget all the other things that bring us apart. Number two, that government will have to again create some unity, bring us together again after so many years of a growing internal and domestic divide. They will have to do it also because they will have a political incentive, because otherwise how can they sit together if they continue with the politics of driving wedges between one another? So what can be the projects of bringing us together? It can be introducing some constitutional changes that will secure the rules of the game. It can be introducing electoral reform that will also play to their interest, because it will reduce sectorial parties. And that can be the agenda, the theme of those parties. And number three, it can be integration of ultra-Orthodox and Arab minorities. So this is about the challenges of the next government that are not the standard challenges of right, left, and center. They're not about dividing the land or making peace with the Palestinians. It's something else. It's huge, it's big, it's important, but it's the only common denominator. Now, do you still want something about education?
Sounds like you were trying to avoid talking about education.
Not at all.
I mean,
I'd like to dwell on one of the points that you made last time round in April 2020, after the last election.
Yeah.
There was a chance to form an alternative government around one issue, and that is that a person with 3 criminal charges cannot function as prime minister. Yet, at the end of the day, as we all know, Blue and White decided to shun the potential Arab coalition partners and join Netanyahu's government. Now, other than that very specific moment, it's you can zoom out and look at the broader trends, and that is that Arab politicians, or the Arab joint list, the Arab parties, came perhaps closest than ever to decision-making circles. They were, just very, very close to being a part of the government for the first time ever. And part of the reason that they were so powerful, and in the polls they are still the third largest party in the Knesset now, is that the voters felt like they were going to make an impact. And now that they were so close, yet these hopes were frustrated, I'd like to ask you, what do you think about the level of engagement of the Arab community with Israeli democracy, and whether, of course, it's going to increase their disenchantment, but do you think that it's really, that was a point of no return in that respect?
Well, this is an extremely consequential question for Israeli democracy, for the future of integration of the Arab minority, and for the Israeli political system at large, because if there's a normalization of the participation in coalition politics, not in the Knesset, but in coalition politics, if the 15 or so seats that represent the Arab minority become legitimate members in a coalition, that changes the numbers completely, and all of a sudden the basic monopoly over domestic affairs and over and the kingmaker position that the ultra-Orthodox parties had will diminish. I won't say vanish, but will be largely eroded. So this is a question that its consequences are huge. Now, what happened? There's some major, in my eyes, positive trends. Number one, good indications for economic integration of the Arab minority, including the government decisions like 922 decision of pouring billions of shekels for infrastructure and so on to develop economically the Arab minority. Number two, trends within Arab politicians and politics, but also within the Arab public that, unlike in the past, give or take 85% of consistently of the members of the Arab minority desire their representatives to be part of a coalition. Now,
I just want to say that completely concurs with my own data.
And just sort of for comparison, in the past, that was unheard of. Join the Zionist coalition that is doing to my Palestinian brothers and sisters terrible things and so on. That was a complete no-go.
Taboo, yeah.
Exactly. And now there's an expectation, we are part of Israel. We're looking at the Arab world. There's nothing much waiting for us out there. Israel is a prosperous state. We have skin in the game. Our future is here. We want to take part. We want to shape. We want to affect the allocation of budgets and so on. So the massive change happened within the Arab population, and that affected the behavior of their politicians. And we've seen changes for the first time, as you indicated. They went to the president and made a recommendation on Mr. Gantz to show we are the ones that are helping shape politics. Now, the same change did not take place yet within the Jewish Israeli majority. About 70% of Jews in Israel are, while they're okay with equal allocation of funds to their minority and so on, believe in equality in this respect, are still
not
uncomfortable with a real sharing of political power with the Arab minority. There's a rationale. I don't know if we want to get into it, but they do not, obviously they accept the fact that there are Arab MKs in the Knesset and so on, but they cannot see a coalition that relies on Arab support. They imagine a prime minister having to confront, say, Hamas in Gaza, and the prime minister is now held hostage by MKs who part of their identity as Palestinians. So the Palestinians, as long as the Palestinians are an active enemy, there's a difficulty here. It's not like 70% of Israelis are, off the deep end.
No,
there's a real difficulty.
As if the Jewish opposition would not support that, but it doesn't hold water.
Now this is beginning to change. We're seeing now with Mr. Netanyahu, and we won't get into the details, but we're beginning to see that the hand that is stretched by the Arab minority that is basically calling, please include me in your politics. We're beginning to see that hard political interest of seeking power and votes in the Knesset is beginning to affect it. And I think it's the process that began is irreversible.
Maybe just in case our listeners aren't following that closely, we should probably mention that Netanyahu has had this well-publicized sort of charm offensive and has taken a step towards, after taking normalization steps around the Middle East, finally realized that he has people he could normalize with right here in Israel. Why was he able to do that and even talk about them as potential coalition partners when Benny Gantz was not able to do that and was too afraid?
Well, obviously Netanyahu, one of Netanyahu's big political projects. One was, we spoke about it before, solidifying the alliance with the ultra-Orthodox parties. He understood this is a strategic imperative. Without this, I cannot secure my premiership. Number two, after I secured the ultra-Orthodox on my side, delegitimizing the participation of the Arab representative. This was a big project. He embarked on it in the mid-90s. He understood that once he delegitimizes the participation of Arab politicians, his majority is almost is naturally secured, and he did it in a very effective manner, using very hostile marketing and communication means and so on. And this was a very successful project because Rabin relied to some extent on the outside support of Arab politicians, and a lot of the incitement that was turned against Prime Minister Rabin in the mid-90s relied on the fact that he's collaborating, God forbid, quote unquote, with the Arab MKs. Now Netanyahu was the chief delegitimizer And now he has a different political calculation, and now he's beginning to legitimize him for tactical reasons, but it might bring about a strategic, unintended consequence of unwinding the big strategic project of delegitimizing their participation.
Do you think it's because he doesn't think he can gain any more votes among Jewish voters?
No, I think his political interests here are, number one, it's reducing the motivation of Arab voters to vote.
He thinks it will demoralize them from voting?
No, not demoralizing. Quite the contrary. If Netanyahu comes to their villages and so on, and he demonstrates that he cares about them, so he doesn't necessarily think that many of them will vote for him, but rather, well, what's the difference? Gideon Sa'ar, Yair Lapid, Netanyahu, they're all the same. Why should I go? And he's better than my politicians that anyway have no impact on power. So it's reducing their motivation to come out and vote against him. Number two, it's perhaps to collect a few votes. And number three, to legitimize a decision of at least a faction among Arab politicians, namely the Ra'am party, to support his government from the outside, should he need those marginal 2 or 3 seats that will make the difference between him staying in power and not. So Gantz needed those 2 seats, and he couldn't persuade his own faction to receive that support. If Netanyahu will need it, he will not wink twice before he will force all Likud members to accept that support.
Okay, we've talked about all these problems in Israeli democracy, the lack of constitution, the instability of the governments, the attacks on the judiciary and rule of law. So many problems. What do you think is the single biggest threat to Israeli democracy today?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily use the word threat. Let's use the word challenge. And you spoke. We're nearing the end of our conversation. I sense it in your body language. And
we wish we could talk for another hour.
And therefore, I'll just mention, because we did talk about the challenges, but it's a great country worth fighting for, right? We have so many things working for us, and this is why we're fighting for it, because there are many areas that we want, to get them right in order to really make it, the most worthy place in the world. Now, what's the biggest challenge? I think, given what we're seeing now with the COVID crisis, response of the ultra-Orthodox community, which is, even to us that we follow them so closely and follow those issues, it was surprising to see, this sort of complete lack of compliance. You were sort of trying to be cautious before, I noticed, but
I was trying to be
because
thoughtful.
Everybody is so afraid. But the truth is, all kollelim are open, not a few. Not a few outliers.
For the Haredi life goes on as usual.
Haredi life, higher yeshivas, lower yeshivas. Forget about Talmudei Torah. It's true that only some. But the yeshiva system at large, while our kids are sitting at home in a lockdown, going crazy from screen to screen, Haredi life is going on while the pandemic is in a major state of expansion there. There is a huge challenge of integration of the ultra-Orthodox community to the Israeli economy and to norms of Israeli democracy. What we measure at IDI, we see that the internalization of democratic norms, the state of internalization of the democratic norms among the ultra-Orthodox community is horrible. Equality for women, 90-something% are against. Equality for non-Jews, 90-something% don't even know what you're talking about.
Let me guess, they really support LGBT rights.
Exactly. and that's a huge challenge if we want Israel to continue to be a Jewish and democratic and prosperous democracy that has a strong army that can secure it. There's a huge challenge, if I have to put my finger, the integration of the ultra-Orthodox community into those values is the biggest challenge, and we have to put ourselves into it.
And on this issue, the Haredi issue and other related issues, may we recommend another interview that we had with Gilad Malach of the Israel Democracy Institute, who specializes in Haredi issues just a few weeks ago. It's in our archive. You're all welcome to listen.
It's a huge subject that we have many scholars led by Dr. Gilad Malach. We understand that it's a huge challenge, and we try to analyze it from all dimensions, both in order to diagnose the problem and to prognose some solutions.
All right, Yohanan Plesner, president of the Israel Democracy Institute, thank you very much for coming on the show again.
Thanks for having me, and I look forward to our future discussions.
Exactly, ahead of the fifth election. And again, thank you to the Israel Democracy Institute for their generous support, and to Itai Shalom, our producer and sound engineer. And now we've got a request, as always. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. All you have to do is launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then, of course, write one. You too can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 600 interviews to keep you entertained and hopefully annoyed. And if you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel, and follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.